Hi, hello there. This is Let's Talk About Myths, baby. And I am your host, Liv, here with another wonderful conversation episodes because, gods, I love conversation episodes. Today, I have got returning guest, Yentl Love. Yentl joined me on the podcast all the way back in 2021. I honestly think she was one of the earliest guests I had. And true to Yentl's expertise and online persona back then and now, she is back to talk about queerness in ancient myth. But now she's even fancier. See, Yentl is teaching a course on queer theory in Classics soon, and so join me to talk all about that. We talked about queer theory, that is the study of queerness broadly, but particularly how it applies to study in the ancient world and what that means for modern people and those in the ancient world. It was generally all fascinating, but we also talked about Lil Nas X because he's deeply relevant when it comes to this topic. No spoilers as to how and why, though. I'm going to let Yentl talk about that because I have never been so enthralled listening to someone talk about a music video. Honestly, just wait. We had so much fun with this chat, and it's really just generally so interesting, but also beneficial. It's important to talk about queerness, gender, and sexuality in the ancient world because it really connects to the modern world. And so I am thrilled to not only have a returning guest, but someone whose knowledge has just grown so much since the last time that she was on. And we all get to learn so much more. And how fucking fun is that? Conversations, Queering the Classical World with Yentl Love, the queer classicist. This is so exciting to have you back. It's wild because you were one of my really earliest conversations. And I think it's been 2 years, which is so bananas. Yeah. So it's so nice to have you back talking about queer things. But otherwise, I just kind of want to chat with you about everything that you do, because I think just all the whole realm of studying queerness in relationship to in relation to the classical world is fascinating. So I know you kind of let's remind my listeners that you were here last time to talk about, I think it was just generally queerness as well, but then we also talked about was it Harry Styles as Dionysus?
Harry Styles. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Which I absolutely love. And at the time I did not know really anything about him. And then last year I listened to so much Harry Styles that it went too far. But then, this time you suggested talking about Lil Nas X, which is also fascinating. But yeah, I kind of just want to hear literally everything and anything when it comes to what you study and talk about and now what you're going to be teaching about, because it's all amazing.
Yeah. Well, and I'm starting teaching about queer theory and queerness in the ancient world, so it's very relevant.
I know. I was so excited to have you want to come back because it's always something I want to talk about, but I don't know enough myself, so having guests on to just tell me everything is so perfect. So maybe do you want to talk a little bit about kind of the queer theory broadly, kind of how it applies to the ancient
absolutely.
world and what you study?
Yeah. So queer theory is basically just a form of kind of literary theory. And the idea is that it branched off from lesbian and gay theory, because the practitioners thought that obviously lesbian and gay theory is very, very valuable, but your sexuality is such a small part of the kind of broader spectrum of who you are that to just focus on your sexuality kind of misses out a lot of the other identities which come together and provide privilege and things like that. So for example, myself as a white queer person is going to have a massively different experience, or a white cis queer person, a massively different experience than a trans lesbian person of colour, even though we fall under the same LGBT umbrella. And so these other identities have a really big impact on who we are as a person. And so queer theory came about as kind of this intersectional approach to primarily studying sexuality, but also it became not just a way to think about alternative sexualities, but to think about focusing on power and who has the power in a society and what is considered normal, and then who is quote unquote the outsider. So when it comes to sexuality, you know, things like heterosexuality is considered kind of the norm, and it has been for hundreds, thousands of years. And so from that aspect, queer theory then looks at like, oh, okay, so these other sexualities are considered to be not normal or kind of deviant. But then one of the really valuable things about queer theory is that you can then bring in other like aspects of study that also focus on the disempowered people and the kind of minority experiences. So in classics, that can mean bringing in things like Black classicism to look at classics through this kind of Black scholarship, and this, like in Lil Nas X, how does the use of ancient history, what does that mean? Like, considering the fact that he is a Black artist, let's look at this through this kind of lens, and what does that specifically mean in the use of classics? And that can be all kinds of things, like looking at both like race in antiquity, but also the kind of reclaiming of figures in antiquity, like the whole debate over Cleopatra's race, ethnicity, that comes up a lot. And then also like the work of like incredible Black classics researchers all across the world that are doing like really amazing work. People like, I think her name's Emily Greenwood. And so it brings in Black studies and classics in this really interesting way. Also studies of disability and antiquity. You know, you can look at figures like Hephaestus, the god, through the lens of disability. And yeah, it opens up a very interesting kind of intersectional approach to studying people who were considered not normal, in quotes, by the kind of general society, people who were on the outside and who didn't have that kind of like intrinsic power that society gave them. And that kind of brings us well into like another kind of really important thing about queer theory, and one of the reasons why I personally think it's so valuable is because whenever you say you're like talking about like the queer experience in the ancient world, you're always going to get people that are like, oh, but you know, gay is a modern term, and you're just like putting modern ideas on the ancient world. Like, I think that's one of the most common kind of like pushbacks.
Oh, it is. Yeah.
For sure. Yeah, I'm sure that comes up in your comments that are, oh, different podcast.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not new to you. So, yeah, and so with queer theory, because you're looking at kind of experiences, and so you can say, oh, the like lived experiences of these people wasn't considered normal by society. So that doesn't have to mean that, oh, it was exactly the same. They would consider themselves a gay person. You're not saying that. You're saying that these experiences were not considered the normal or the right or the proper kind of lived experiences for a person in antiquity. And yeah, so when we're using queer theory, we try to say things like homoeroticism or same-sex attraction. And when I was first coming into classics, I found that really annoying because I was like, why are you like shying away from just saying, oh, this is like a gay person? Yeah, I found that it really frustrated me. But what I've come to kind of like learn throughout it, and I completely get that people are frustrated, that people say this person experienced same-sex attraction instead of just saying this person was probably gay. I get why that is annoying, especially when you're like looking for reflections of yourself in the past, as we all do. Completely get that. But I think one of the like potentially easiest ways to understand why it kind of makes a difference is, for example, now, like I really like a sweet breakfast. I'm a sweet breakfast kind of person. If I see someone eating a savory breakfast, I don't then immediately put them in my head with the label savory breakfast eater, and I don't say, oh, like this person, you won't ever imagine, but they eat a savory breakfast. Couldn't believe it. I saw them eating a savory breakfast, because we in the modern world don't consider that an identity.
Yeah.
And so like in the same kind of way, in the ancient world, things didn't necessarily, our identities don't necessarily match up with what ancient identities were. In another culture, maybe what type of breakfast you eat will become a defining identity. And then people in the future looking back might say, oh, it looks like this person enjoyed a sweet breakfast from now and again. But it still wouldn't be correct to put that kind of label, which is why we use these terms like same-sex attraction and homoeroticism, which you absolutely can see all the way through history. And yeah, so that's just a slight and I know I do appreciate that it can feel like you're just kind of scared to say these people were probably gay. But it's just all because of that, because identities don't necessarily match up through cultures and through time. But experiences do, and attraction does. So, yeah.
That's really interesting. I love that kind of explanation. And I think it's like, I mean, yeah, as much as people can be frustrated by that, explaining it is really helpful and like gets that across of the why that is, you know, a good way of phrasing it. Like myself, and you know, obviously I'm in a different situation. I'm not in academia, I'm not studying, and I am working. Like my work is meant to be for literally everybody, so I'm not I don't go too deep into like phrases and, you know, all these different like terms. But for me, I've taken to saying things like, you know, this person was probably, or was maybe what we would now call gay and stuff, which I think is like it's not as obviously specific and detailed as using those terms, but it is kind of like another way of doing that, where you're like, I'm not putting that on them because they would not have seen it, but like in order for modern people to understand, you know, it's kind of like that. But I'm interested how that, like, or what kind of terminology you would use. Like one of the things that I really like to talk about is the, you know, the mythology that exists around trans people in the ancient world. And so like, is there a kind of phrasing in that respect when you're talking about, you know, those myths that we might see now as resembling trans stories?
I mean, I think that with that, just that, like, for example, when I've been writing papers about like these early kind of conceptions of like Aphrodite or Venus that you see on Cyprus, where you get this statue that is kind of shaped like a woman, has like breasts and kind of feminine hair and feminine clothes, but that has a beard and often like a dick, a penis. I don't know what you would say on the show.
Whatever you want.
It's the beauty of podcasting.
Exactly.
And was thought of as both male and female at the same time. We get this guy called Macrobius, who's ancient Roman in like 400 CE or AD, depending on what you want, who's writing about this. And figures like that, I think the term non-binary is incredibly useful. And obviously it has, even in the modern day, people that are non-binary, there's a massive kind of spectrum of, you know, the pronouns they might use, the way that they outwardly present themselves, the experiences that they have. Non-binary even now doesn't have like a set definition or a set kind of experience. It's still this broad spectrum of experiences that we put under the label of non-binary. And I think in that way, I personally will use non-binary in my writings because it's just in the way that this isn't what the ancient world might have put in the category of male or female, like these two separate categories. But then even that in itself is kind of a flawed way to look at it, because our male female binary that we have now is kind of this direct result of Western colonialist views. And what we consider male and female now as two separate defined identities, we can't, just like we can't say, oh, there were necessarily these sexual identities in the ancient world. We don't know that our understanding of gender or our thoughts on gender match perfectly with the ancient world. We don't know whether that's the case or not. And, you know, there are a lot of these figures in antiquity that don't seem to fall in either category. So I would say, personally, I use non-binary when I'm talking about things that don't seem to be presenting in the kind of traditional masculine or feminine fashion. And then there are, I think, actually, what you said about how you would describe how people in the ancient world, who we might today call lesbian or whichever, I think that kind of works quite well, because you get, like, for example, the Roman emperor. Give me one sec, because I'm just going to make sure I'm saying this right, because there are so many syllables.
Oh, God. Yeah.
Yeah, so the Roman emperor Elagabalus.
That was the one I was going to guess when you said so many syllables.
Exactly. I'm always like, which ones come first? But yeah, when we have like records of him, and obviously the records are potentially written by people who are trying to suggest that Elagabalus wasn't a great emperor and are trying to like slander him a bit. So we don't know like necessarily how absolutely accurate all of these are. But when they say things like, oh, they wanted to be known by a female name, they like acted like a wife to other figures, and there's one record that suggests that they offered a massive amount of money to anyone who would give them a vagina.
Wow.
So things like that, I would say, suggest that emperor may have felt what we would call transgender, may have been transgender. But yeah, so I think that, yeah, like you said, that's a really good way of kind of talking about these things, that these experiences, how we might understand them today is through this lens. I mean, because even like what ancient people considered to be marriage is very different to what we in the modern world, in modern society, would consider to be marriage. And marriage as a concept is very different in different parts of the world. Like, we do have these abstract concepts, and we, you know, put them onto the ancient world and put them onto different aspects of society as best we can, to kind of say, hey, this might be a helpful way to understand this, and this might be mirrored in this practice. But at the end of the day, none of it is perfect. None of it matches on. But yeah.
Yeah, that's very... I didn't know. I mean, I'm just so deep into Greece that like I didn't even know about I'm not going to try to say their name. That emperor. I didn't know about that emperor. I knew the name, but like I didn't even know the reference point. Like as soon as you said a bunch of syllables, I was like, is it that one? But yeah. I didn't know anything about them.
Yeah.
So, but that's really interesting. And like I always come back to, there's so many myths. Like a lot of times, you know, in somebody like Ovid with these transformations, that like we can read as resembling transgender identities in, you know, in the modern world. And
yeah, absolutely.
Like, yeah, and I always like to talk about them, like not least they're interesting, but also, you know, they're I think really helpful for people who identify that way now to like see themselves in the ancient world. And so especially where I'm coming from, where like it's very much for a general audience. You know, it
Mm-hmm.
is so nice to have those kind of phrases where I can say, like, I think, you know, this person is what we would now see as trans. It's
Yeah.
nice because it's like,
Yeah.
it's very accessible, and you get to use that same word that people identify with now, and just sort of becomes beneficial in that respect.
Yeah. And especially like, you know, when we have this author, this Roman author, Lucian, who writes this, it's called the Dialogues of the Courtesans. It's not supposed to be factual, it's supposed to be like funny, but he's writing between of this kind of story, and it's between two women, and one of them is saying to the other, like, oh, I've heard you're like sleeping with this woman now, like tell me all about it, I want to hear all the gossip about it. And we hear this story that they're telling each other of this character who's called Megilla, but later says, no, call me Megillos, takes off this wig, has a shorn, like, bald head, and says, I'm a man. And this girl says, like, what do you mean? Do you mean, like, did a god intervene? Like, what, are you, like, a eunuch? And Megillos says, no, like, I was born like you, but I'm a man. And very clearly, and says, like, oh, you'll see, like, I can pleasure you just like any man would. But it's very, like, adamant that no, like, he might have been introduced as Megilla, which is a female name, but he is Megillos. He's a man.
Yeah.
And I don't really know how else someone could interpret that. You know, like,
that's pretty straightforward.
Yeah. And people say, you know, oh, but, you know, this is a comedy, this is, you know, but even if it's a comedy, even if Lucian is like laughing at this character, even if this is some like transphobic joke, that doesn't mean that for a transphobic joke to happen, trans people need to have existed. Like, so regardless of whether Lucian is like making fun of Megillos, that doesn't undermine Megillos's existence. Like, he still exists as a character that Lucian has written.
Yeah, it's like, where would he have gotten the idea? Like, it's
Yeah.
like the same with all the myths are like that, which I love, because the myths are a lot less straightforward. So I love that there are these like very straightforward examples from real people. Like, that's wonderful. I always forget that Rome can kind of give us that stuff when Greece can't always. But like, the myths are, you know, are kind of, they have a similar vein, which is just sort of this idea that, like, obviously these stories existed in some form, and so yeah, whether or not the person writing them or telling the stories, you know, approved or like believed whatever the story, like, they're still telling the story, and thus a person we can see as trans now still existed, like, regardless. So
yeah, exactly.
yeah, the argument that Lucian was making fun of them and thus, like, it's not real is like bananas.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, since we're on this, and like, I kind of want to jump around and talk about everything, but you brought up the statues of Aphrodite, and so yeah, one of the other things that you kind of suggested we talk about was like trans Aphrodite, and that's something that I have not looked into much, but like, I've always kind of known stories of, and so I would love to hear more about these ideas of like a trans Aphrodite.
Yeah. So I love this idea and this concept of like a trans Aphrodite. I think it's one of the most, like, one of my favorite kind of interpretations of god or goddess from antiquity. And actually, Bettany Hughes wrote in her book Venus and Aphrodite, which is an amazing, amazing book. She writes about how the kind of like birth story of Venus or Aphrodite is that you have this Titan, like OG god Uranus, and his son cuts his dick off and throws it into the sea. And then from this cut off dick,
I call it castration foam. That's been my
okay, nice.
I've kind of coined that term.
Yeah, I love that. I love it. From the
foam.
castration foam, up comes Aphrodite. And so biologically, Aphrodite just is 100% male. There has been no female influence in her creation. She's 100% come out of a dick. And so Bettany Hughes talks about this and says that it could be this early recognition of a non-binary nature of sex and desire, which I think is a really interesting starting point. Just that she comes out of this kind of mythology in a really interesting way. And then, like I said, it's in Cyprus that you see these kind of sculptures of the goddess in like a traditional female form and dress, but then wearing a really thick beard. And you also, alongside these kind of depictions of the goddess in these sanctuaries across Cyprus, you see these non-binary figures who appear to have been potentially what we would call like transgender priests. So these figures don't fall into a typical category of male or female, and they're all kind of coming together in this worship of Aphrodite in this specific region.
And I'll just say too for the listeners, like Cyprus is also mythologically where she was born, which I think also says a lot about that, like where that castration foam erupted was said to be off the coast of Cyprus.
Yeah, exactly. And Aristophanes, this playwright, talks about Aphrodite and says that she was brought to Athens from Cyprus, and that on Cyprus people worshipped Aphrodite, Aphroditos. So that's an Aphrodite in both like female and male form, and that she had these massive like celebrations where people cross-dressed in her honor. Like all the way through in loads of different sources, we find it all coming back to Cyprus, and then there being this kind of fluidity of the kind of gendered appearance and associations with the goddess, which I think is just so, it's just so interesting. As I said before, this guy Macrobius, this Roman writer, who then talked about this again, about this statue of Venus that, had a beard, was dressed as a woman, but then was exposing the fact that she had this dick, and they conceive of her as not just female, but also male. And he lists off a whole bunch of different authors. So also Aristophanes again, and he's this guy Lavius, and Philorcus is another one. And he has them all in a list, basically just like providing more evidence to the fact that, like Philorcus also says that men sacrifice to her wearing women's dress and women in men's because she's held to be both male and female. So reading that, there does seem to be this association, and it isn't found all over ancient Greece. Like it seems to be very specifically located to Cyprus. But it's just a really fascinating kind of like mini celebration in the kind of broader scheme of celebrations of this goddess of who's, effectively of, love, beauty, sex. She's like this pinnacle of like, at the time, what it meant to be this desirable woman. And then you get this just really interesting, like kind of focus in on this non-binary approach to, as Bettany Hughes said, this non-binary nature of sex and desire. And that's expressed through sculptures. It looks like what the priests might have worn and identified with, and all of these like worshippers. And it's just a really interesting kind of case study into the fact that ancient history wasn't just cisgender binary, this is male, this is female, but there's just this like massive colourful spectrum of experiences, and it's really cool.
Well, and it makes me think too about the fact that she is tied to the story of Hermaphroditus, which is like this idea of an intersex person. And it feels like, I mean, that it's interesting that story is sort of, and I don't know the regionality of that. I'm forgetting where. I know a lot of it probably comes from Ovid, but I'm trying to think of like anything earlier sources. But it's interesting that like she has this nature tied to Cyprus, but even in the broader kind of sense, she still has these kind of, fluidity of gender stories, or this story of a person who is just inherently both, biologically, and that's sort of interesting in itself, or like a sort of a connection to like the broader Greek world, having these stories that tie in with Aphrodite, and even the eros of it all too, because there's all these different kind of stories about what level of like relation eros has to Aphrodite. Like there's the idea of like kind of primordial eros, but then also the eros that is more directly born, like sometimes it's like he's born alongside her too. Like I feel like Hesiod is the one, or he also talks about the primordial eros, but then he also has this eros that is born like almost with Aphrodite from that foam. And that kind of feels like a similar thing, where it's like we still have these kind of like, unlike the rest of the gods, which kind of have their sort of one-off thing that they're the god of, and there's only one and they're gendered and whatever, like love is the thing. Love and desire and sexuality is the thing that gets, even in the most sort of conservative tellings, you still get a female goddess and a male goddess of those things. And then if you do look into it beyond that, and are looking at it more for that kind of non-binary fluidity nature, like you can sort of see how the two of them kind of act in tandem as this kind of like team, so that there is like a broader spectrum when it comes to really specifically sexuality and love and desire and everything.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, I completely agree with that.
Yeah. Do you know, I'm curious, like, especially because of where Cyprus is, like so far east, there are all these ties with Aphrodite to goddesses of the east. Like for some reason Astarte is the only one I can think of right now. But and like Inanna and Ishtar, do they have those connections to Aphrodite? I'm questioning everything now. But basically, do you know if those Eastern forms that kind of lend themselves to Aphrodite historically, like whether they had any kind of trans nature as well?
Yeah, like they completely do. Like, so we've got like in Phoenicia we have like Astarte, and then like in different areas of the Near East it's Ishtar, and then from Ishtar you can go even further back to ancient Sumeria to Inanna, and I think it's Ishtar, but also it might crop up in some of the worship of Inanna as well. But we have these texts that talk about like how amazing their goddesses are, and they say, and your ability to turn men to women. And there are these things that pop up about different like priests and priestesses, where these ancient goddesses were seen to have the ability to take someone who had been identified male at birth, and then through the worship of this goddess was then transformed into something else, whether they were then considered to be like a woman, or whether it was just like no longer a man. But yeah, we see this ability in these kind of this Near Eastern goddess worship with Ishtar and Inanna, who it seems like they can transcend the normal like boundaries of gender, and they have the ability to enable their worshippers to kind of transcend this typical binary, which is actually like a big part of when you're looking for evidence of especially kind of like transgender experiences. It often comes through divine intervention. Like it's very much seen like, okay, that's why I think the example with Lucian and Megilla or Megillos is a really interesting example, because that's one of the only ones where there isn't any kind of god involved. But all the way throughout like Ovid's Metamorphoses, with the characters like Iphis and Caeneus and people, they they all change gender through the intervention of a god or goddess. And yeah, it's very much seen like this is the ability of the divine to do this. And so, yeah, that's quite an interesting connection, I think, that the divine have. Yeah, that it's seen as something that can be, I wouldn't say necessarily a gift, but it's seen as like to change gender often requires a god involved in these stories, which isn't to say, of course, that like that was the experience of lived people in ancient times, but just with the literature that we see, a lot of the literature attributes that to the gods being above nature and above the kind of limits of people and culture and all of this kind of thing. The gods act outside of that, and so they can change things that people might not be able to.
Yeah, I've always kind of seen it through those stories specifically, and I do think mostly of the same ones you mentioned, like Iphis and Canis, but like the idea, I mean, Canis is a little bit different and weird because there's like a trauma involved. But Iphis is a good example where it's almost like the god was just kind of able to give them like what they wanted, and sort of like fix what was seen as a problem. And it's kind of nice, it's kind of like it's almost, and it's impossible to say what people's lived experiences were, like you said, but it's kind of nice to imagine that it was seen like that, where like a person who, felt like they were born in the wrong body, could have this example of like, oh, well, like at least somebody like me got changed by the god to be who they felt that they were, or things like that. It's kind of like, it's just kind of nice,
Yeah, I know. I think you can really like, because the whole point of like ancient stories, they're supposed to be entertaining. You're supposed to like enjoy reading them, right? So I think there isn't anything wrong with like trying to find affirmations and find like good bits in them. So like even this story of Canis, who, like, as you said, am I saying that right? I haven't said that in so long. Canis,
I was trying to remember it. Well, it's both, and I think Canis is when they're a woman, and then Canis is when they're transformed into a man. So that's why I know I questioned it too. I haven't read Ovid. I know I haven't. I've read Ovid, but not that story. It's actually on my list of like, I'm probably going to cover it around the time when this episode is coming out. But I think you had it right.
But okay, so like even in this depiction of Canis, as you said, the transformation comes from trauma. It's not a nice position that we find this kind of change in gender. We don't find that happening for a good reason. But at the end of the passage, about like at the end of this kind of story, we see this big fight between the centaurs and the Lapiths, and Caeneus is in that fight, and some centaurs are like chatting shit like, oh, like you're not even a real man, you were born a woman, like you're not a proper man. And then Caeneus like completely beats the shit out of them, like wrecks them all. And then at the end, there's this kind of affirming, like, oh, see, like, he's a real guy. He did everything that you could do. Like, and the characters then really support Caeneus and attack this kind of transphobic centaur, which is like a mad sentence. So like,
transphobic centaur is a whole vibe.
Exactly. So like, even in a story that begins with a massive amount of trauma and like pain, you can still kind of take away these potentially like affirming aspects. And I think that's like an important thing to remember, that like stories are you're meant to enjoy these stories. They're not just things. I don't think the classics should ever like remain just things to like study and these kind of like dusty texts that you just have to think really critically about. Like at the end of the day, these were stories designed to entertain people, and I think it's important that they kind of remain like that. Like they should, otherwise the whole field is just going to die if people don't feel like they can actually enjoy and relate to I mean, as you can see with all of the retellings that are happening at the moment, like I know that's like big about how many different kind of like stories we're seeing coming out of there. And I just think it's so valuable. I'm like, yeah, we should all be like reading all of these different myths and all of these stories by these ancient authors. They're crazy entertaining. Some of them are unbelievably like awful, but in the best kind of way. Like, if I don't know, have you ever read any like of Juvenal's work?
No.
When I'm sure you'll eventually like cover Juvenal's satires. Like, oh my days, that it's stuff that is like shocking to joke about now, but it's still like massively entertaining to read. And yeah, so I think that there is something really valuable about finding the joy and the affirmation in these ancient myths and stories. And we shouldn't forget that these are stories. They're designed to be told and to be read and to be interpreted in whatever way you want, because these are fictional stories, like things like Ovid and things like that. And yeah, I think a lot of the time, especially, and like as someone in the field, I maybe at times I'm part of the problem, but I think we can put this very kind of like clinical, like, you know, we just analyze all of this stuff and forget that like its primary purpose is like as a form of entertainment. So yeah.
I mean, I say this all the time, but like I started the podcast specifically because I studied ancient Greece and mythology, and then like didn't do anything with it for a while, and then I was like bored and sad one day, and I was reading random things and came across the story of Pasiphae conceiving the Minotaur. And I just remember looking at it again and being like, this is wild. Why did you, like, more people need to tell stories of Greek myth while emphasizing the fact that this is wild, with like versus how they're so often covered, where it's like, this is just the story from the ancient world. They were so brilliant and interesting, aren't they perfect?
Exactly. Yes.
And meanwhile, you're like, the woman had a constructed fake cow created so that she could fuck a bull. Like, we need to talk about something as well.
Days. Yeah,
exactly.
Sure.
Or like, I mean, Lucian is a good example. The only Lucian I've read is the True History, which is one of the funniest, most absurd things that I've ever read in my life.
Yeah.
It's just like nonsense. And I love the idea that ancient writers were just like writing nonsense because they felt like it and they thought it was funny. Like, that's amazing. And
absolutely.
And it's not talked about enough.
Yeah, for sure.
On the other side of it, one of the things I thought of while you were talking about all of these kinds of stories and sources and things is like, one of the things that comes to me so often when I'm trying to tell queer stories from the ancient world is that, like, one, there are basically no explicit stories of women having sexual relationships, which I find fascinating and have my own like silly theories on that are not based in me having read anything. But but also, every time there are stories of men having sexual relationships and romantic relationships with other men, they like always end badly. Like, it's always a god with a mortal man, and that mortal man always dies. Or like, if they're not a god, then it's just like the Achilles and Patroclus of it all. And so I'm curious, like, if you've kind of looked at that, or like what your thoughts are on how inherently tragic like 95% of those stories are.
Yeah. I think a lot of it comes from the idea that there was a right and a wrong way to have relationships between men. And so it kind of links back to this like idea of pederasty. And that's like often like quite like a red flag idea. Like, people get very like het up about it. But the idea was that in the ancient world, people were attracted to youth. And that's basically like the whole thing. They thought like a lot that people were ready for sex and relationships a lot younger than we might think. So like, but it's not just, and I think this is where it can potentially be like a dangerous thing, because people talk about how, in pederasty, there's normally this older man that is called, now give me one sec, because sometimes I mix up the...
I had this conversation with somebody like 2 days ago. Yeah. Great.
So the Erastes is the older man, the Eromenos is the younger man. And so the Eromenos, the younger male often is going to be around 15-ish, between like 14, 16, like before you can properly grow a beard. And then the Orestes is, 30, a lot older. So obviously not in modern standards, not an okay relationship, like very bad. But also young girls were getting married at the same age.
I was just going to say that because I feel like that is not mentioned enough in reference to it. Like that,
exactly.
That occurred to me.
I think
when
that
you
is
said it
so
too.
important to compare, because people then demonize this one relationship, which I absolutely think that it should be. I in no way think that this is at all okay. But it was also happening between men and girls as well.
Yeah.
So this isn't just like the gays the gays were doing it this way. This is everyone of whichever, sexuality, whatever preference these people may have had. They were all older men were having sex with young people. That's how it was across the board. And that was what was acceptable. But in a lot of these stories, what you see is these kind of tragic stories between men. It's often men that are a similar age, or that seem to be a similar age, that definitely don't necessarily fall into the Erastes, Eramenos categories, which is why, like, we have these records in the ancient world of people debating with Achilles and Patroclus, okay, who was the Erastes, who was the Eramenos? They're really trying to like nail it down, because that is how a relationship with two men was supposed to work. One was supposed to be older, one was supposed to be younger, in order for it to be like socially acceptable. So to me, I think that is why a lot of these relationships, you can see it between like Heracles and Hylas, or as you said, like Apollo with so many different men.
All of them. Yeah.
All of the gods, like just with all of these different guys. And it always ends tragically. You never get like a happy ride off into the sunset moment.
You know what though? Sorry, that's so true, except Zeus and Ganymede do kind of come across as if it's a good thing, and that's specifically like the age gap.
Yeah.
So it's that's interesting. It's like that's one of the only ones.
That is actually true. Yeah, and that's actually really interesting, because Ganymede is a young Trojan prince. Like, that is the whole thing, that his youth is kind of emphasized.
And he doesn't die, and everyone else dies.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, that is really interesting. But like in a lot of these other ones where people do die, it seems to be that they're like kind of closer in age, or that their ages aren't, and their roles within the relationship aren't clearly marked out. And so potentially, I mean, this is like my interpretation, but I think that potentially these relationships aren't condoned by society, and so they have to end badly, because society isn't ready for them to end well. It kind of like arguably just falls back into the kind of like bury your gays trope that we even see on like TV now. But yeah, I think that because they weren't necessarily completely like socially acceptable, because they didn't fall into this pattern that they were supposed to, they weren't allowed to end well. Yeah,
that's really interesting. So around the time when this conversation will air, I also had one which I only recorded 2 days ago, so it's like in my head, and I'm trying to think of when they're all coming out. But I talked to somebody about specifically Achilles and Patroclus, like primarily in relation to modern reception, but we talked a lot about that kind of Eromenus and Erastes situation, which is so interesting with them. And one thing that occurred to me in that conversation is also that like they don't fit it, and they die tragically, like you're saying. But what's interesting about them is like the people who then debate that so heavily in later texts, like the big thing that is sort of like glaring when we know it is that like when that story was being told, like the Iliad, when it was existing in its first iterations, is probably, at least based on our evidence for sure, before the relationships of Erastes and Romanus, like, and pederasty broadly, like, became popular. So it's kind of extra interesting on this like other level. It doesn't really explain. I mean, I think that they both had to die because that's just like the way the Iliad had to go, and it's kind of unrelated to their romantic relationship in a way that like Apollo and Hyacinthus, it's more related to like what you're talking about. But it is really interesting to kind of imagine them having all these debates, and they're like so mad trying to figure out like who basically was the top and who was the bottom. But it's like, dudes, like this was before that was a thing. Like you can't understand it, which is why you're so annoyed trying to figure it out. Yeah.
But for them to be, you know, this amazing work of literature, but you can't possibly have like a relationship between two men that doesn't fall into this like Erastes Eremenos paradigm so quick. Like, how does it work? How can we make it fit? Yeah,
it's so interesting. I love it. I mean, also it's all dark, but like that. But okay, so that one of the things I said earlier, and I would love to know if I'm wrong about this, but like the lack of two women who have romantic and sexual relationships in ancient Greece, I find, or mythology specifically, but I'm like, if there's any from history too, amazing, I want to hear it. But like, other than Sappho, but like, it's interesting to me because it like, my little theory that, again, like I have not read anything about whether people have talked about this or debated it or what have you, but like my little theory is basically that like it's only a matter of who recorded the stories that we now have, and they probably, especially because of their kind of obsession with penetration that comes along with the pederasty, that they basically just like, if they were considering whether women were having sexual relationships with each other, they didn't see whatever women did to each other as sexual, and so they just like, it's like it kind of went under the radar. And I like to imagine that in a really good way, of like women were kind of able to be more sexual with each other than they, than we might think, purely because nobody saw it as sex, and so they didn't get into any trouble. And like, but then it also meant that it never made it into, myths or anything. Like the closest we have obviously is like stuff you can kind of imagine based on Artemis, but it's certainly never explicit.
Basically all of this is kind of like really framed around male pleasure. Like, one of the kind of things that people draw most often with Artemis is her encounter with Callisto, right? And Jupiter, or Zeus, disguises himself as Artemis in order to assault Callisto, because that's the only way that you can get close, is by pretending to be Artemis. And so you can like draw from that, oh, well then it would make sense if Artemis and Callisto would potentially sometimes have like sex, or they were in some form of like relationship, there was some attraction, because that is how Jupiter had to disguise himself. But even that is framed through male pleasure. Like it's an awful scene because of what we know is happening. Like it's obviously like incredibly tragic, but that's how people might like get that kind of like infer those things about the character of Artemis. Even one of the places where you kind of see depictions of what might be women like having sex with each other, double-ended dildos, things like that, is on this like pottery that was normally used in symposiums. But again, like these kind of like banquets between men, where men are drunk and then have these like, oh, look at these women like having sex with each other. It's then like not really about women. It's all again like viewed through the lens of men, like, oh, this is like what they might have then found attractive to have seen. So like you said, I think it's all to do with like where are the sources coming from. We don't actually hear, apart from people like Sappho, and we know there were other people like Gnosis, another like female poet who's said to kind of done the same thing, but mainly like Sappho is kind of the big one.
And even still, people debate her. They debate whether or not she actually was like writing for somebody else about a woman, or if she actually loved women. It's like, oh my god,
was she imagining how would I feel if I was a man? Like, is that just literally trying to write out any any kind of like same-sex attraction, anything? But ridiculous. The only other kind of thing that we do have is people like Juvenal that I mentioned before, talking quite negatively about like certain women that he thought were like too masculine, and they'll even like have sex with other women. So he like talks quite negatively about, like the tribas, which like in Latin like comes from like the word to rub, and this idea of like these women that are like, they're so like awful, they're even like having sex with other women now, and they like look so ugly and they look so manly. And again, like this is all coming from like a very, very male view, who is like, are these women going to be threats to me? These women aren't acting like women normally should. But it's very limited what we have.
I mean, it's so interesting. People ask me about those stories all the time. Like, why don't you talk about stories between women? And I'm like, it's not my fault. Like, I would love to. I promise I would. Like, it is entirely, it's all about like what it comes down to with like most of my podcasts, which is like, it's all about the patriarchy. But like,
for sure.
There's a reason that we have the sources that we have, and it's not because that like, it's not because women weren't writing stuff down, or women weren't telling stories, or women weren't having these experiences. It's just that they don't survive for us today because of all the men who stood in the way.
Exactly. But it's like the fact that we only have like, we have so few of Sappho's poems left, even though we know there were tons out there. But, the men came in and they burnt them all, and now we don't.
Yeah, and even the ones we do have are like a fluke.
Yeah.
It's like, they're all like, we found this piece on like another thing. Like,
exactly.
It's utterly fascinating. I also feel like I am just always required now to think about the time that I released an entire episode on Sappho and the island of Lesbos, and then had somebody on Twitter tell me that I was using a slur. And that if I was
no, seriously,
did you miss that?
I missed
oh my god
that.
Yes, it was a couple years ago, and I did this entire episode dedicated to Sappho, and the episode title was called "The like lesbian from Lesbos" was like in the title.
Yeah,
and I got a DM from somebody on Instagram, and I don't know what their username was or whether it indicated anything about them, but like I just remember really specifically that their image was a picture of Taylor Swift, and which I think it just says a lot. But basically they DM'd me and they were like, I found your podcast and I was scrolling through the titles, and that's key. They didn't say they were listening. They were scrolling through the titles, and they were like, and I saw that you used the word lesbo, and I was and they're like, and I just want you to know that that's a slur and you should take it down and never use it again. And then they were like, if you're a lesbian, then I'm okay with it. But if you're not, then I'm not okay with it. And it was the funniest message I've ever gotten. And I like replied to them and I was like, that is the wildest thing I've ever read. Like, the episode is about the origin of the word lesbian. Like, you need to get a grip. It's an island. That's literally where the word. I was like, I told you the history of the first official lesbian, and you're mad at me because I used the name of an island.
You read the titles of the podcast.
Exactly. You didn't listen. Days. I can tell you that. Anyway, the funny part was that I tweeted just a screenshot of like the DM, and my caption was something like, this is the wildest thing I've ever read. I was talking about Sappho. And it was like my most viral tweet ever. And also the number of people who like still got mad at me, or then I had the people who were like, it's pronounced Lesvos. And I was like, I know it is in modern Greek. It's fine. Like, just that's not the point. Like, that's not the purpose of what's happening. Anyway, It was an incredible experience, and I think about it every single time that I think about Sappho now.
Yeah.
It's the funniest thing that's ever happened. But then they're actually really nice, and they replied like, "Oh, thank you for teaching me." And I was like, maybe you should have just like even clicked to the description, which literally says this episode is about Sappho, the origin of the word lesbian from the island of Lesbos. Like, I made it really clear.
Yeah. And like, thank you for teaching me. Interestingly, what a podcast can actually do if you actually press play and you actually listen is it could actually teach you just itself.
Or like literally Google one single thing before you think I'm using a slur.
Yeah.
And then of course I had a lot of lesbians in my comments being like, I don't think that's a slur. Is that a slur?
No.
It was like, it was generally a great experience. Anyway, I don't know how we got there talking about Sappho, but it is, it's so fascinating, this kind of like complete lack of women's stories. And I mean, I think my like sort of happier way of seeing it is just the idea that they were all have been really sexually satisfied with each other at all times, but because they weren't necessarily using traditional modes of penetration, the men just like didn't see it as sex, and it never got written down, or if it did, it just got lost because of, you know, Christian monks later being like horrified.
Sure. Yeah, no, absolutely.
Okay, I mean, God's topics, everything exists. But I do want to hear more about like because you talked a little bit about Harry Styles' Dionysus last time, like tell me what you've kind of studied when it comes to Lil Nas X and like queerness and classics and whatever. Yeah.
Oh, so I'm just obsessed with Lil Nas X at the moment. I'll be in that top 0.1% whatever. But yeah, so Lil Nas X, it's specifically his music video. I don't know if you watched the Montero Call Me By Your Name music video.
I did back when it came out. Yeah, but it's been a while.
So this music video, unbelievably amazing, as everything that Lil Nas X does is, but it basically, the video itself is like, has a lot of ties with the ancient world, with antiquity, and it kind of like really emphasizes that. At one point you see this inscription on a tree, which is from Plato's Symposium, and I don't know if you covered Plato's Symposium in
I did
episodes.
Really early on, and I think I did like now I look back and I'm like, that was not a very good job. There's so much more to say. So actually it's funny you say that, because I'm going to cover it again in better detail around the same month this is coming out. So maybe
perfect. So
maybe this will line up really well.
So it's specifically referring to this part where Plato has this character Aristophanes say, humans originally were like made of two parts, and then they were either like male female, or female, and then Zeus feared their power, split them down the middle, and now we all search for our original half, and that's like where our soulmates are. That's why we have soulmates. But it's also kind of like this early explanation of, that's why some men are attracted to other men, that's why some women are attracted to other women, and that's why some men are attracted to women, some women are attracted to men. So it's kind of like this really early like explanation, mythology behind why soulmates exist for them, and why people are attracted to different people. So yeah, there's this quote in ancient Greek written on a tree, and it's referencing that.
Such like a deep cut too. Like there's a really, really specific type of person who is going to get that
reference. Exactly. Yeah, because it's not even like it's like written in English, but it's
I
actually in
get it.
ancient Greek. No, I literally paused it, got out my like ancient Greek dictionary, and was like trying to piece enough together that I could be like, oh, Plato's Symposium, okay. So it's a very niche reference. And then right at the end of the video, this scene where he gives a lap dance to the devil. If you can tear your eyes away from the spectacle, you can see that there's this Latin inscription in front which says, again, it's in Latin, but the translation is, they condemn what they do not understand. So like super meaningful, absolutely amazing. But so you have right at the start, right at the end, these ancient Greek and Latin texts that kind of just emphasize the connection with antiquity and the ancient world. And yeah, you get this from the start. You go through a kind of ruined landscape where there's this broken down like Doric temple, and Doric temple is this style of temple that in ancient Rome particularly becomes like associated with masculinity.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Just like straight blocky, and they're like, okay, so that's male.
Yeah, yeah. It's
And then
like
the curvy one is
the...
female.
Sure.
Because everything has to be male or female here. But yeah, so it becomes associated with masculinity, and as well you have these like this broken down like aqueduct, which again in kind of like Roman thought, in the kind of politics of their expanding their empire and conquering, they were like, okay, we'll build these viaducts, transport water to where it was dry before, and in that way we have like conquered nature, and we are like above nature. And so then Lil Nas X comes in, and these symbols of masculinity and like conquest and power are all like crumbling and decaying. So it's kind of like this early idea of what the music video is going to be, and like this is going to be this kind of disruption of traditional masculinity and power. And he just like moves on through to this like scene where he's seated looking very femme. He's got like long pink hair, he's got long hair, pink guitar, and then there's this big like snake coming out from behind, and immediately that's kind of like biblical Eve, serpent, temptation kind of thing. But also like Apollo is often associated in antiquity with the snake. And then it starts like chasing Lil Nas X, and he's running past this like figure made of stone, like that's kind of half into a tree, which is like, to me, very symbolic of like Daphne, who, you know, Apollo was turned into this tree to try and escape Apollo, and faces emerge from these purple flowers that look like hyacinths, and then essentially this is all kind of linked in. You have this like predator chasing, which I would argue Apollo pretty much always characterized as a predator, just an awful shitty god, like the worst.
Truly.
Just truly awful.
Poseidon is sometimes, well, I stand by Poseidon as the absolute worst of the Olympians, but Apollo is really
a
up
close
there.
second. The Theseus of the gods, if you will. Just the shittiest. Yeah. And then you see Lil Nas X, he goes down into this kind of amphitheater, and he's in this chained up. He's got this kind of like faux fur pink like kind of cape across him that looks to me very kind of Hercules-esque. Even the hold which the chains are on is like in weightlifting, is like the Hercules kind of like hold.
Yeah. And I feel like it's in an old movie. I remember seeing people talking about it when that video came out. And I think it's like, in an old movie about Hercules, he's like specifically standing just like
exactly.
that. Yeah.
And Hercules is so seen as this kind of like, especially now we kind of look at him as this kind of like heroic ideal, but he's also in like ancient texts, there's a lot to do with him kind of like subverting gender norms. Like in one of his, in one of his labors, he like famously goes to the queen of the Amazons and has to wear her clothes and act like a woman, and while she wears his, and then he has this lover Hylas, which obviously ends tragically, as all of these stories do. But so he is,
Hylas is taken by women. That feels like kind of means something too. That's interesting. Sorry, that just occurred to me.
No, I definitely think there's something there. And my favorite kind of aspect of the video is where you see Lil Nas X go from his kind of like chained Hercules, however you want to call him. He tries to go up to ascend to the heavens, and he's like cut down. Has the very famous like pole dance scene where he's like spiraling down, amazing, down into hell. And it forms what we know in ancient stories as the catabasis, or the kind of descent into the underworld. And we see it in like all of these stories of heroes, Aeneas, Odysseus, like Heracles, yeah, all of these characters
Mm-hmm.
have. I don't actually know whether Heracles does.
I
Just
don't
said that.
think, I don't think
he
Theseus
does.
definitely does.
Theseus definitely does. But
Yeah.
okay, so
He does it badly,
in the
but he does
leagues
it.
of heroes like
Oh no,
yeah.
of course Heracles does, because he goes and gets Cerberus.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Okay. Just doubted
Yep.
myself, but no.
No,
Thank
so
you
did
for
I
that.
immediately.
Yeah.
And then I was like,
I was
wait a
like,
second.
what?
It's very obvious.
I don't remember that in the Disney movie, but no, he does actually. In the Disney movie as well. I don't know what I'm talking
He
about.
really does it in the Disney
He really
movie.
does.
Yeah, even more.
So it effectively like kind of places Lil Nas X in the ranks of these heroes, and all of their kind of descents into the underworld form this massive part of their like narrative arc. And I think that's especially important with when we look at, okay, how is classics used now? And disappointingly, a lot of the time that we see classics used in like kind of modern politics and culture is it's been really latched onto by white supremacists, right? Who see the ancient world as like they are the inheritors of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and they see this as this kind of like idealized white society, which it absolutely categorically wasn't. Like they are 100% wrong, but they see this, and like it's when you see their like them with their like Molon Labe placards, and it's like all of this kind of like referencing to the ancient world, which on a side note, the stupidest thing, like why are you referencing ancient Sparta? Like Persia did beat them.
Thank you. I say
Like,
this all the time. Because
so-
Molon Labe means come and take them. And it's
And
like
they
Persia
did.
Yep.
Persia did.
They took them.
Like they took them. I mean, I don't think any of these people with the placards are particularly keen on, actual facts here. I think we can all agree that they are ridiculous and anyway, yeah, that always gets me.
Yeah, same.
But yeah, so, and especially Hercules or Heracles, who's often like these white supremacist websites like really, really love him, really love all these heroes. So I think it is like massive and so important and incredible to see this like black artist, this black man who has been raised to the ranks of a hero, like a hero alongside Odysseus, Aeneas, like all of these ancient heroic figures. He's been raised alongside them, and he completes his heroic narrative. So he fights the devil, gives him this lap dance, amazing, then like kills him, takes his crown, and then gets the wings that he would have needed at the start to ascend to heaven. So he's completely like completed this heroic narrative, this katabasis, and has brought himself into the ranks of like the Homeric hero, the ancient hero. And I think it's this like beautiful kind of reclaiming of antiquity from the hands of white supremacists who hold up these heroes as these kind of like pillars of like what they think is this like great like white heterosexual toxic masculine ideal. And then Lil Nas X comes in with this like beautiful performance of like femininity, black excellence, black beauty, like comes in with all of this and then puts himself alongside these heroes. I think it's unbelievable. It's so powerful, works on so many levels, and it just really challenges this toxic, heteronormative, white idea of what a man should be. And I think it's just beautiful. It's amazingly done.
Yeah, it challenges that, and it so explicitly challenges those everything that you're just talking about, this like white hetero narrative when it comes to ancient Greece and like especially when it comes to like, or ancient Greece and Rome I should say, but when it comes to like classics broadly too, like there's all these really and I don't know enough about it, and so I won't pretend like I do, but I know that like there's a real distinct lack of specifically Black people and more broadly people of color who are like studying the ancient world and not for any lack of interest, I imagine, but more like all of the different systemic reasons.
Yeah.
And so like it's nice on that level too, of having that like a Black man putting himself in the classical world, which is like absolutely he would have had a place there, but like the modern world sees that he doesn't. And so that's so lovely. Also, it just sounds like an amazing video, and I'm going to watch it again.
Yeah, absolutely. You should. I presented on this at this the annual meeting of postgraduates in ancient history in Malta, and I presented on this, and so I had to watch the video. I would say I've contributed at least 1,000 of the views that are on there. I was going frame by frame, and I still love it, and it's still like just as amazing to me as it was.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, but yeah, I think it's incredible and also very needed, because like I was trying to think, I can't remember what her account name is. I feel like on Twitter it's maybe like Artistfully or something.
Oh yeah, Brittany.
Brittany, right, who does and we've just seen again, she did like an amazing depiction of Athena, who happened to be black and has got a massive amount of racist backlash over it. And it just shows that like how important it is to reclaim classics back from this disgusting white supremacist narrative that has come along. And yeah, and it's, you can see as well, because like we had the Lil Nas X video, and then I think it was just like months later, it wasn't a long time later, then Lizzo did her Rumours video, and again that drew really heavily from antiquity. And so I think we're seeing this really like beautiful pattern of like black artists like reclaiming this culture that has been used against them in a lot of ways. And you know, people used ancient history to justify all sorts of like awful things, slavery, racism. It's been used in
eugenics,
in so many ways against black people, against people of color more broadly, against so many people. And so I think that it is powerful and amazing and so valuable and needed to see this kind of reclamation that we're seeing at the moment.
Yeah, it's really wonderful to watch. And I think that more like positive note, because I had another thing to add, but we're going to end it on the positive note, because that's absolutely fascinating, and I just love it. And I loved hearing about, I also love how in detail you can describe that music video, just like, I'm assuming from
I could
memory.
do frame by frame from memory, at this point,
I'm very impressed.
I close my eyes at night and I just see it.
Not so bad. That seems like a fine way to live.
For sure.
Well, this has been so much fun. Thank you so much. Do you want to tell my listeners? Oh God, yeah, I'm so happy to have you back. I'm so glad you asked. Do you want to tell my listeners where they can like read more from you or follow for whatever you want, or just literally anything and everything?
Yes, so I am most active on Twitter, which my Twitter is just queer classicist. But then also I have a website, thequeerclassicist.com, which has taken a backseat in the last few months because I've had a lot of conferences and papers that I've been writing, but it is everything that I've needed to do has now been done, and so it's now at the front of my attention, and so there will be like more coming up there, but everything is shared on Twitter. Twitter is the place I spend way too much of my time, and so everything new that I'm doing goes on Twitter first. So yeah, I'd say that's the best way to find out more. Yeah.
Great. And I will link to everything in the episode's description too, so everyone can click and find it easily.
Nice.
Thank you for doing this. This was so much fun and so fascinating, and it's so lovely to talk to you about all these wild and so entertaining and important topics.
Yes, it's been so lovely talking to you too. It's been great. Won't leave it 2 years before our next chat.
Yeah. Exactly. Good. Oh, how fun. I love talking to Yentl again. We talked about Rhodes because I'm going to Rhodes. I think I put that off mic, but I'm so excited, and now it's all I can think about. And gods, I just loved learning the intricacies of these, just these more specifically academic ways of approaching the subject. It's interesting, even if it isn't necessarily how I go about it on the podcast. It's so valuable anyway for me to know, for me to share. Plus, gods, listening to Yentl describe basically every second of that Lil Nas X video, madness, incredible. I was enthralled. Like, so fucking fun, all of it. So as always, a huge thank you to Yentl for joining me, and make sure to follow her on Twitter or check out her Queer Classicist website for more. I have linked to both, as always. Last time, she and I talked about a Dionysian Harry Styles too, and this time Lil Nas X and queer theory. Honestly, you get it all. And if you haven't listened to that last episode with her, oh my god, please check it out, because Harry Styles is Dionysus. Oh, gods, I made a real admission off mic when it comes to Harry Styles too. I have listened to a lot in the past year. Let's Talk About Myths, baby, is written and produced by me, Liv Albert. Michaela Smith is the Hermes to my Olympians. Honestly, Michaela does so many things. She edited this episode. She's been editing so many conversation episodes so that I don't lose my mind, and I love her to the ends of the earth for it. Stephanie Foley works to transcribe the podcast for YouTube captions and accessibility. The podcast is hosted and monetized by iHeartMedia. Help me continue bringing you the world of Greek mythology and the ancient Mediterranean by becoming a patron, where you'll get bonus episodes and more. Just visit patreon.com or click the link in this episode's description. I am Liv, and gods do I love this shit.